He's basically right, except that I have to state it for the record that I never believed that neoliberalism was serious. It was, neoliberalism is not a system of government, of the economy, it is an ideology. Imagine if we were today in Moscow in 1980, during the Soviet era, towards the end of the Soviet era, and somebody said, oh, I believe we need to go beyond Marxism. Well, Marxism was irrelevant to the Soviet Union. It was just an ideological cover. Karl Marx would have been the first to be in the Gulag had he lived. Similarly, neoliberalism is neither here nor there. In a sense, the only significant aspect of neoliberalism is that it emerged in the 1970s as an ideological, religious or semi-religious cover-up for financialization and the surrender of many important sectors of the economy to private monopolies. So if the question that Rafael is asking is, should we go beyond that? The answer is absolutely yes, but this is, there's nothing new or liberal about that situation. I am also of the view that 2008 was such a tremendous crisis for capitalism that now we have a whole host of new problems. And neither neoliberalism nor social democracy nor Keynesianism, none of the old isms are pertinent to our circumstances.
Well, I think Raphael's entirely right. We need to urgently rethink the premise of our economic system. There is plenty of evidence, whether it's from scientists mapping the changes in our planetary health, whether it's communities around the world feeling frustrated and desperate and lacking hope for their future. There is no doubt that we need fundamental transformation of the economic system, whatever you call it, whether you call it capitalism, neoliberalism, financialization. What is not in doubt is that we need urgent change, and to the very heart of what we define as the role of the economy and the purpose of the economy. Should the economy be a goal in its own right and we should just grow it faster, incremental increases in GDP? Or are we going to make a deliberate attempt to align the way the economy operates with what people and planet really need? Focus on delivering collective well-being for everyone across the world. So that requires new goals for the economy. That requires thinking much harder about what the economy generates in terms of who's winning and who's losing, what is manufactured, how we consume, how we design cities, what sort of business we have. It's a challenging task, but there's never been more urgent need for it.
Well, I've always found the word or the label neoliberalism very difficult to understand. And most of the people like me, who I suppose were broadly on that side, never thought of themselves as neoliberals and never know quite what it means. My perspective on this is, broadly speaking, we're going to continue with a capitalist economy. There's no chance that we're going to eliminate it. Plans that are based on eliminating the capitalist economy are absurd. There is no credible alternative. However, how we manage and guide the capitalist economy can and must change over time. It has already changed many, many times in the last 2 centuries in terms of the policies that influence it and what other things governments do. And I think the lessons of the last 15 to 20 years and the coming challenges of climate make it clear that there are further large shifts that are required towards a more interventionist state, but one guiding the market and guiding capitalism, because it will remain the dominant engine of our economy. There is really no serious alternative.
Well, the idea that there are physical limits to the extent to which we can exploit the planet is an old one and a very accurate one. But there can be no limits to capitalism. Capitalism knows no bounds. Capitalism operates on the basis of the commodification of goods that are not commodities. And anything that can be exploited at the marginal revenue, which is greater than marginal cost, will be exploited. This leads to the old-fashioned social democratic position that the state needs to interfere and intervene and put limits upon capitalism. That's all gone. It's all pie in the sky. It's finished. It's dead in the water. Social democracy has died. And it died when the capacity of any government to rein in capitalism simply withered into thin air. And why has it withered? Because due to globalization on the one hand and financialization, a very important aspect of globalization, it's not that governments don't have power. During the pandemic, we realized how much power they have. They can actually lock us up if they want to. But let me put it this way. The political mechanisms that we have are simply not up to the task of imposing the demos will upon capital. Put bluntly and in an almost brutal fashion, governments are owned by big business and big finance. Even if you look at the government in Germany today, because Germany is a significant country, it's a powerful country, a powerful government, a powerful state. Nevertheless, look at what is going on. There is a new coalition, a newly elected coalition of three political parties, the SPD, the Greens, and the FDP. To form a government, each one of those parties had to ditch everything that was substantial about its platform, which means you have a government which essentially is on autopilot. It can't change anything. And the powerful interests that make sure through the media that nothing can be changed maintain business as usual when business cannot be maintained as usual. So to respond to the question very directly, we cannot place limits upon capitalism because capitalism is just too powerful. Either we have to reconsider the property rights over the machinery of capitalism. Who owns the machinery? In other words, be much more radical, or the game has been lost.
So Yannick, I'll confess to you, I used to work very closely with Kate Raworth, and she's a good friend of me. And I remember back in 2012, when she first had just a discussion paper, even before it was published, I remember reading it. And once you've got this idea of the donut in your mind, it is very hard to look at the world differently. Once you think about the need to simultaneously protect the planet and respect its limits, but also at the same time and as part of the very same conversation, think about what humans around the world need. You can no longer separate the two. So what the donut really usefully does is gives us a state of play. We can map how far we're breaching those planetary boundaries, and we can also map how our fellow citizens are falling below or actually being supported above that social foundation. It gives us an understanding of where we are. Then the much more important but also much more challenging task is what sort of changes, models, pathways, different practices do we need to get ourselves inside that donut, inside that safe and just operating space. And fortunately, there are loads and loads of people around the world who are coming up with different ideas, whether it's reimagining the purpose of business, whether it's putting circular economy practices into our manufacturing and consumption systems, whether it's rethinking how we get our energy, whether it's putting economic democracy at the heart of how we understand the economy. All sorts of different changes are needed, but that's the conversation. We need all sorts of folk to pile in on that because it's a challenging, multifaceted task. But where we start with a vision that's not just faster economic growth, but respecting both humans and the planet simultaneously is a really, really good place to begin that conversation.
I largely agree with this. I like Kate's book. I didn't entirely agree with it, but it was a good way of framing it. I think the big point to make is that the economy, well, one way of thinking about this, the economy is embedded in nature and it must respect the limits that nature imposes. Similarly, the economy is a social phenomenon. It's a product of and a core part of human society and has always been so. From the very beginning, we are a social species. So we're at a point in which we recognize these environmental limits in a way that 200 years ago, for obvious reasons, people didn't, because our economy was so much smaller and less intrusive. And our society has become much more complex and also rightly and properly more demanding as we become richer in terms of security, in terms of support for education and everything else. So we have to recognize this broader framework, what I think of as the environment and society, in our policies and our choices.
Well, I would agree. I've been advocating basic income for a while now. I've become convinced to the need of basic income. But you see, basic income, to be basic and at a level which makes a difference, is a major departure from from the system we have. It's not just a minor tweak. It's not just adding a little bit of social welfare. The ideological battle needs to be won against those who claim that in the system we live today, you have any opportunity of the majority of people, and especially young people from now on, making a decent life for themselves out of work, out of waged labor. That's gone. It's gone because you have the triumph of precarity, of precarious jobs over good jobs. The number of people who are actually, as we speak, not only contribute to society by looking after their neighborhood, their neighbors, their environment. No, the way in which they contribute to the formation of the capital of the megaliths like Google and Facebook and Amazon and so on. Every time you upload something on Facebook, every time you enter Amazon.com, you are contributing to the capital of these big tech giants. And you see, you mentioned before my theory that about techno-feudalism. This is not my prediction. This is my assessment. I don't think that we are running a risk of living in techno-feudal times. I'm arguing that we already do. And the fundamental difference, you see, this is not another phase of capitalism. I don't agree with those who say that capitalism is here forever. It's not here forever. Nothing is here forever. Every social formation is going to wither and die, and something will replace it. And I believe that since 2008, the financial crisis of 2008, capitalism has been on the way out in the same way that socialism died after 1991 and the fall of the Soviet Union. And the two main pillars of capitalism that have gone or are in the process of collapsing. What are the two main ingredients of capitalism? One is that it is driven by profits. And the other is that all value is created or exploited or extracted in markets. Well, profitability is no longer what drives the system. What drives the system, and look at the European Union as we speak, it's the European Central Bank. It's central bank money. Without it, no business, big, small, tiny, medium-sized, is going to survive. So private profit has been replaced as the fuel that drives the engine of our economies by state money. And remember, when state money is being issued by an unelected central bank, then we have a serious problem of politics. The second thing is markets. Increasingly, markets are absolutely sidelined, either because they're being monopolized. So, you know, when you have a choice between two companies in any sector, that's no choice really. But the most important thing is the new platforms like Amazon. The moment you enter Amazon, you exit capitalism. There's no market in Amazon. It belongs to one man. Maybe lots of sellers sell their stuff. Yes, of course they do. And lots of buyers go in there. But that doesn't make a market. It's a kind of fiefdom. There's an algorithm there which decides what you see and what you don't see. We don't all see the same thing. If you enter Amazon.com, you'll see different things to what I see. And that's determined by an algorithm that belongs to one person or to a small band of people. So, you know, in that sense, we have a new system in which the capacity to make people do things, this is what power is. the capacity to make others do what is in your interest, not in their interest. This power has concentrated immensely in the hands of very, very few people. This is not just a question of wealth inequality and fairness. No, it's a question of power. It's a question of a tyranny. Some people, very few people, at the 1% of the 1% of the 1%, have the capacity to make the others, everybody else, work for them without receiving wages. Without receiving wages. It's not in standard capitalist exploitation. So this is why we need a basic income. And the question is, who's going to pay for it? This is the crucial thing. Anybody who supports basic income has to answer the question, where will the money come from? It must not be taxation, because we cannot tax the rich fat cats, because they have fantastic ways of avoiding it. The money has to come from ownership of shares in those companies. Those shares must be redistributed in the same way you have a wealth fund in Norway, in other countries. We should have in Europe, let's say, a European sovereignty fund, where the majority of shares goes. In any case, most of those companies only survive because of the central bank. So let no one tell us that this is privately produced capital and what right does society have to expropriate it. We have every right, because without us, there would have been no research in the things that created Apple and Google and so on. And if there was no central bank, there would be, their valuation in the stock market would go to zero tomorrow morning, right? And the other thing is, of course, in the same way that the central bank prints money to keep financial markets afloat, we should all have a digital wallet on a digital euro or a digital dollar, a central bank digital currency, where everybody has a wallet. And in the same way that the central bank prints money to give to the bankers today, that give to the corporations, everybody's wallet should be replenished with basic income. So my advice to our friends who are interested in basic income is, don't buy the rubbish that the money is not there, and do not support taxation financed basic income. It has to come from the central bank, and it has to come from the returns to capital.
So Sarah's emphasis on the universal basic income, I think, is really fantastic. Lots and lots of people around the world are starting to think about its relevance. There's lots of experiments happening, starting to build the sense of what it might look like in practice. One of my favorite aspects of universal basic income is how it potentially can change power dynamics in the workplace. It can give workers more power to go along and demand better quality work, because if they've got a basic that they might fall back on, then they don't need to accept being treated as just-in-time inventory, as we see from so much of the economic and the employment opportunities that are on offer. I would say a couple of caveats with UBI. It has to be high enough to be above the poverty line, and it really has to be universal. There are some proposals, for example, that wouldn't include refugees. That misses the point, the social justice credentials. So we need to think about some of the practical implementations, but at its most basic, there are some good reasons to pursue UBI as part of a wider suite of changes. It's certainly not a silver bullet on its own.
Well, I am genuinely agnostic to doubtful about basic income. The problem is very, very simple and fairly obvious. Even in the most stripped down versions, the basic income is really quite expensive. So my colleague Martin Sandbu has produced a really stripped down version for Britain with a number of adjustments. And it costs about 5% of GDP, which is £100 billion. And it means raising a lot more revenue, which will be politically very difficult. Then the question is it the highest priority use, or if we can raise this money, which is certainly all we can raise, to give money to everybody, most of whom, remember, aren't going to be in those categories. Most of them will be rather well off. Maybe the well-off partners of high-earning people who are staying at home. Maybe people who have substantial capital income, and so forth. So we are going to be giving a lot of money to people who don't need it. Why not pay wages to carers? Why not pay people to do these valuable things directly? This seems to me a far better use of money. Now, if public finances were no constraint, I would have no problem, but they obviously are. So I am very skeptical. It sounds wonderful, but I think it's going to lead us in the end, and we can go into detail, to sacrifice things we really want: research and development, education, health. These are all in the mix here for things that we actually really don't think are that high a priority.
This is a bit like asking, should people eat or drink? There's no such trade-off. We should drink and eat. We should have universal services, and we should have a basic income. And it's really very simple. Let's not allow ourselves to be conned into thinking that there must be a trade-off. We have to give up one or the other. No, we are not going to give up either one. In a civilized society, education should be public and should be free. Health service should be public and it should be free. We've seen during the pandemic that private medicine is a dismal, toxic failure. You saw what happened with private clinics and private health service providers when the pandemic hit. They ran for cover. They dug holes in the ground and they hid themselves in there. And they did nothing to contribute to the fight against the pandemic. Why? Because they cannot capitalize. You cannot capitalize. Let's say, let me put it this way. Take the case of a private health system. What is its greatest nightmare? That people will get well and that we will be able to avoid being sick. That's bankruptcy for them. So it's clear that no civilized society should be reliant upon private health. We should have public service health, education, and some basic social care, because this is what civilized societies do. And then on top of that, we should have a basic income in order to unleash the creative potential of people. Because the difference between a basic income, a universal income, and welfare payments is welfare payments are like nets that catch fish in the sea and they do not allow them to swim away. Once you are stuck in with an unemployment benefit, whatever, a poverty benefit, right? Then once you start making above a certain sum of money, then you lose it. And that operates like a magnet keeping you down, a net that has entangled you. Whereas a basic income, everybody gets it. There is no stigma attached to it. And to those who say to me, oh, well, that will create a society in which everybody is going to be lazy and do nothing. I say to them, look at the upper class. Look at the upper class. They don't let their kids starve. And they don't think that if they feed their kids and make sure that the kids have a roof over their head, their kids are not going to be creative. Why do they think that everybody else's kids will be different?
I know, I think I'm a huge fan of universal basic services. We know from evidence that they are a much more environmentally friendly way of delivering these sort of public consumption goods that people need. And we also know that they have a huge role in reducing inequality. Of course, there's questions you want to have, a democratic conversation around what would go into that basket and how big that basket of services might be. And that would be up for dialogue with citizens and their government. What I wouldn't say is that it should be an alternative to universal basic income. I think they potentially can complement each other really nicely. So you have a foundation of universal basic services and then a security of income, which people can have more discretionary spend over. Put them together and you're starting to talk about a really nice beginning of a fundamental change to our social contract and how the economy operates.
Well, I certainly agree broadly. And that's, of course, what the welfare states did. And I mean, I see this as having two aspects. One is insurance. There are a very large number of risks in our society, inherent risks, always have been, by the way, used to be starvation. Now we have different risks. People used to starve. We can create insurance systems, and the state is an ideal insurer, and that's what the welfare state is about. And that can be developed to deal with current risks. And then, of course, there are direct goods, sometimes called merit goods, things that people need, and the questioner has listed a number of very important ones. And historically, of course, governments have played a very large role in providing housing. Now, energy is clearly crucial, housing is another. The question, of course, is transport is much more complicated. It is how you go about providing those services in the best possible way. And they're all somewhat different. They don't have the same technical characteristics. So this is where I'm afraid you have to get into quite clever policy. What does it mean to provide universal transport? The needs in some parts of the country are quite different. Does that mean you provide free train travel wherever you want to go? I mean, that would seem insanely expensive. How do you do energy? How do you control the use of energy if it's completely free? So I think there are solutions to all this. You can provide basic minimum quantities of energy which are free, and then you're priced at the margin. Now, you can say that's a universal service. Yes, it is. So yes, broadly speaking, I think that's what we want to do in many areas, but how to do it is very complicated.
Mondragon is a very great source of inspiration to many of us. And I think that the answer must lie neither in state-owned enterprises nor in privately owned capitalist enterprises, but somewhere in between. And Mondragon is a good example of cooperatives. I would go all the way out, and I have done that in a recent science fiction novel that I wrote in order to explain my vision of the good society. I call it Another Now. In it, I say, imagine if we did one simple thing. Imagine if we transferred the very simple rule from the political sphere, one person, one vote, to corporation ownership. One employee, one person, one share, one vote. You can't, suddenly, like in politics, you cannot lease, rent, sell, or buy votes. So imagine if we had the same thing. So, you join a company. It's a private sector company in the sense that it is not owned by the state, but it's owned fully by the people who happen to be there. And the people who happen to be there just get one share each, one vote each. So each one of them is a shareholder, an equal shareholder. And the same way that you have a shareholders assembly that makes the decisions, and today with electronic devices and electronic voting schemes and software, this can be very efficient too. You don't need long meetings or anything. You can have perpetual voting of employees, and not everybody will vote on everything because you don't know everything and you don't care about everything that happens in the corporation, but you do have a vote on the things that matter to you. Then suddenly you have a combination of flexibility, autonomy, liberty, and no capitalism. And then you can have markets that are liberated from capitalism. Now that, I think, is an important notion. Markets free of capitalism, because you see, most people, especially youngsters, have grown up in societies where people keep telling them that capitalism equals markets. Not so. Capitalism is not markets. You can have capitalism without markets, or with monopolistic markets like Amazon.com. That's capitalism in a sense, right? But there are no markets and there's no competition. And today, with the technologies we have, it is inevitable that if you have private ownership of companies, of tradable shares, the shares are going to end up belonging to 3 people around the world, or maybe 30. Okay, and then you're going to have a complete majestic market failure, with markets suffocating. So if you care about markets and you want competition, you must not tolerate capitalism. That is my message.
Yeah, Joshua, I, like you, take a lot of inspiration from some of the models and practices that we see in Scandinavian countries. I'm particularly excited by things like the foundation corporations that we see in Denmark, moves to shorter basic weeks that our Scandinavian colleagues have been much better on for a longer period of time. Seems like the rest of the world's now starting to catch up. And also just that real sense of collective care that we see in those models. Mondragon also is a great example of designing businesses that have a purpose other than short-term profit extraction. And I'm a huge fan of worker cooperatives. We see them around the world, and I think we need much more of them to make up our economic system. I would say neither is perfect on its own. We know that Scandinavian countries still have a pretty heavy environmental footprint and are still largely growth orientated. So I think we need to go beyond just greening the social democratic models and actually rethink the purpose of the economy, one that's better than growth, rather than an economy that's designed for and dependent on growth and then spends a lot on redistributing through welfare systems, as we see in Scandinavia. I'd also say that countries like Spain and the Scandinavian countries certainly don't have a monopoly on good examples. We see the sorts of changes, the sort of new practices, the sort of different ways of doing things emerge around the world, whether it's examples of Buen Vivir in Latin America or Ubuntu in South Africa, our Bhutanese colleagues with their gross national happiness. There is no sort of orientation or clustering of where the good examples comes from that sits in Scandinavia or in the Basque region. There are plenty of great examples, which just proves that there are thousands of alternatives. We know what a different economic system looks like. We see it through chinks of light around the world. And what we now need to do is collaborate to bring about that change so that they are now what makes up the economy rather than the exception that proves the rule.
I think those are very interesting models. And I've just been to the Basque Country and I've been very impressed with what they've done. The really deep question, and to which I cannot give an authoritative answer, I simply don't know enough, and I think nobody does, is how far these models, which are clearly the product of very deep, historically formed social capital, which are the product of in small societies, to some extent, feeling beleaguered, at least by all the big powers around them, which are very cohesive historically, with a very strong sense of social and community identity. These tiny countries, all of them are smaller than London. So how far can we replicate that or anything like that in the bigger countries of the world? Germany or Britain, or let alone the United States. And I think we genuinely don't know. I have come to the view that part of the answer in those countries must be a much more radical approach to devolution. And I think the German federal model, for example, has shown itself good in that respect. On the other hand, the American federal model looks a terrible mess. So I think this is a profound question. I like these ideas, including cooperatives, but can we replicate them more broadly? I think is a very open question.